The topic is interpreting Edith Stein in Indian spiritual context, and the spiritual perspectives of Edith Stein, deeply embedded in the Occidental philosophy and Christian thought, shares deep truths with the Indian philosophy and Indian spiritual tradition. By comparing Edith Stein with the Indian spirituality, I would like to create a space for interreligious, intercultural, interscriptural bridges in creating spaces in the human community. The medieval concept of via negativa, taken by Edith Stein, resonates the apophatic tradition in the Indian scripture. According to the refined spiritual school of Vedanta, the ultimate purpose of life is God realization, and this is understood in terms of associated responsibility, which is explicitly brought out by the theme of intersubjectivity. A dialogue between the Indian and Steinian views presupposes a deconstruction of the different cultural heritage and suggests that better understanding of the human person is not only possible but also needed. My paper entitled Interpreting Edith Stein in Indian Spiritual Context highlights the rich interscriptural and interreligious approach towards the mystical reality. This paper bridges the Oriental and Occidental categories of mystical theology and finds the traces of Steinian categories of body, soul, and spirit in the Indian spiritual concepts. This paper brings importance to holistic development of humanity despite the religious barriers. I believe that integral human development is a key idea in Edith Stein that moved her to go beyond the cultural and religious barriers. In this paper, I would like to present Stein more as a person who willed, wished, and worked for realizing a greater humanity which embellishes her life and writings as a living anthropology to our modern society. Here, I share with you the image generated in AI, artificial intelligence, symbolizing the encounter of the East and the West in the realm of spirituality and mysticism. With this introductory note, with the great saying of a Tamil poet, Kanyan Pungundranar, saying, Yadum ure yavarum kelir, which means the entire world is a common home for all, I begin to present to the intercultural and interspiritual study on Edith Stein. The main tenets of this presentation is Steinian and Indian understanding of self, soul, and person, the concept of empathy as intersubjective reality in realizing the union with God. The methodology of Edith Stein corresponds to the Jnana Marga, the intellectual way of the Indian way of realizing the divine, and at times the Bhakti Marga, the devotional way of the devotional way in the later part of Stein after conversion. The tripartite division of the person has close connections with the understanding of formation of a person in Indian mystical traditions. It explores this complementarity and connectivity in these two traditions. Introducing the concept of Indian philosophical tradition. Vedanta, one of the 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy, offers a comprehensive and profound view of the nature of reality, self, and the divine. It is rooted in the ancient scriptures known as Vedas, with the Upanishads being the most important text within Veda. The Upanishads, often referred to the end of the Vedas, explore the ultimate nature of reality and the relationship between the individual self, Atman, and the supreme reality, Brahman. Central to the teachings of the Upanishads is the doctrine of non duality Advaita, which asserts that the Atman, the individual soul, is ultimately identical with Brahman, the universal soul. And in this image, you could see Atman, which is the individual reality, and Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. And according to the Indian scriptures, Brahman, the ultimate reality, is Atman, and it is in realizing that ignorance, and it is in realizing that through knowledge we could attain that Brahman realizes there is the realization of the self. Steinian and Indian understanding of self, soul, and person. In her philosophical works, Edith Stein explored the nature of the soul, particularly in her analysis of human being as a spiritual and transcendent being. For Stein, the soul is not merely a psychological or physical entity, it is an immortal spiritual reality that participates in God's eternal being. In finite and eternal being, Stein emphasizes the idea that the soul is inherently oriented toward God and that the highest fulfillment of the soul is found in union with the divine. Stein's view of the soul bears a similarity to the Vedantic notion of the Atman, just as Vedanta posits that the Atman is inherently divine and can only realize its true nature by recognizing its unity with Brahman. Stein believes that the soul's highest purpose is to transcend the individual ego and unite with God. This union for Stein is not simply an intellectual realization, but a profound mystical experience. The soul, in her view, is capable of direct communion with the divine through prayer and contemplation, leading to the ultimate realization of its dependence on and participation in God's eternal being. Stein's precise understanding of the finite persons finds its perfect realization and expression in the summum bonum of the scholastic tradition, the being that gives ultimate meaning to the finite world. The created person is capax Dei, that has the capacity to receive God through, though he or she limited in essence and existence. The paradigm shift from divine person or God to the rational, physical, and spiritual, human, finite structure of the person reveals the latter's analogic perfection. Thus, Edith Stein's thought enables us to search for an indispensable ontological structure and a unifying infinite being that is foundational to the human person. This same aspect is seen as the Atman Brahman aspect in the Indian scriptures. Now coming on to the mysticism in Edith Stein and Indian Upanishad literature. Both Edith Stein and Upanishadic sages, the mystics, view mystical experience as a means of transcending the limitations of the material world and entering into direct communion with the divine. Stein's approach to mysticism is deeply influenced by Christian mysticism, particularly the mystical tradition of John of the Cross, as we saw in the previous presentation. But it also shares several features with the Upanishadic idea of spiritual realization. To know what is Upanishad, first of all, Upanishad means the greatest and finest teachings revealed. It literally means a disciple at the feet of the master. And I suppose this AI generated image tells us that our protagonist, Edith Stein, too, as a disciple of Husserl, and then as an ardent follower of Thomas Aquinas, and then dwelt in the teachings of Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, follows her master, her eternal master, whom she found the truth as cosmic Christ. For Stein, mystical union with God is the highest calling of the soul, a state of being that transcends ordinary consciousness. In her writings, She emphasizes the importance of silence, inner stillness, and contemplation as the means by which the soul becomes receptive to God's presence. This experience is not merely emotional, but involves the whole person, mind, will, and heart, opening up to the divine love and truth. The mystical path for Stein involves an emptying of the self and openness to God's transformation. In Upanishads, similar themes emerge. The spiritual journey described in these texts involves overcoming the ego and realizing the non dual nature of existence. The Upanishadic sages speak of the practice of meditation, dhyana, and contemplation, upasana, as ways to experience the ultimate truth, Brahman. This experience of union with Brahman is characterized by an intense sense of stillness and realization of the oneness of all existence. In Advaita Vedanta, the practice of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is considered the highest form of spiritual practice, wherein one comes to understand that the individual soul, Atman, is not separate from the supreme Brahman. And we now enter into another realm of our comparison with Edith Stein and Indian spirituality, the composition of human being. And in this presentation, in this slide, you see the tripartite division of Edith Stein, body, soul, and spirit. And in Indian spirituality, we call it as the tripartite division in the Indian scriptures is Sharira, Manas, Atman. The physical body is called as Sharira, the mind or intellect is called as Manas or Buddhi, and the soul or the self is called as Atman. The physical body, like in Stein's model, the body in Indian philosophy is seen as a material aspect of human being. In Vedanta, this is often called as Stula Sharira, or the gross body, which is composed of the elements earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and subject to physical laws. And the second composition is that of the mind or intellect. The mental or intellectual aspect corresponds to the emotional and intellectual faculties. In Vedantic philosophy, this includes the manas, the mind, which is responsible for perception, emotions, desires, and intellect. The intellect, buddhi, it is a discriminative power that allows a person to understand and make decisions. And the third division is the Atman, which is the soul or self in Indian philosophy, particularly the Vedanta and Yoga. The Atman is the deepest and the transcendent aspect of the human being. The Atman is the true eternal self, which is not bound by the body or the mind. It is pure consciousness, often equated with the divine and ultimate reality. Both Edith Stein and Indian spirituality recognize the body as a crucial part of human existence, but it always seen as something that is interrelated with the soul, mind, and spirit. In Indian thought, the body is seen as a vehicle or temple of the soul, while for Stein, the body expresses the inner self and has a functional role in the person's life. The soul in Stein's philosophy and the mind in Indian tradition serves as a center for emotions, thoughts, and self-awareness. Both are concerned with personal identity, feelings, and intellectual life. In Indian traditions, the manas, the mind, is often seen as an intermediary between the body and the Atman, influencing the individual's experiences and behavior. In Stein's view, the soul, which includes the psychological and emotional aspects, is crucial for understanding one's personal identity and moral development. Both traditions recognize a higher dimension to human existence, one that transcends the material and psychological realms. For Stein, the spirit is that which connects the human being to God and to the transcendent truth. In Indian spirituality, the Atman represents the true self which is identical to the divine or ultimate reality. The concept of the Atman is a deeply spiritual idea that emphasizes liberation from the material world, often associated with the realization of one's divine nature. Now, coming on to the next comparison, the idea of self surrender in love in Edith Stein and Indian traditions. I would like to present the concept of self surrender in Edith Stein, through which we note the sharp similarity in the Indian concept of Sharanagati. In finite and eternal being, Stein identifies this self surrender in love. Wollenfang writes like this: love is a self surrender to the loved good, and such self giving in the true sense is possible only when a person is an object of love, so that love in the full and authentic sense proceeds from person to person. Self surrender aims at union, eins werden, sorry for my German pronunciation, and it attains to its perfection only when the gift of oneself is accepted by the beloved person. This eins werden is what the Indian systems, namely the orthodox and the heterodox systems, call as the moksha, nirvana, mukti, and so on. Entering into the very important realm which was loved by Edith Stein, the phenomenology. Phenomenology of Indian scriptures differs with that of Edith Stein. The comparative study made by Edith Stein on the phenomenology of Husserl and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas leads her to the stream of hermeneutical phenomenology. Bosco Correa, a scholar in Edith Stein in India, argues that according to Edith Stein, the important difference between transcendental phenomenology and the scholastic philosophy is that the former is egocentric and the latter is theocentric. Now, after the influence of Thomas Aquinas, Edith Stein comes to the realization that human beings experience contingency with the eternal transcendent being. This experience of human insufficiency, she calls it as the metaphysical insufficiency. This leap of Stein from phenomenological realm to the metaphysical realm is a key to understand the difference in Indian spiritual mysticism. Again, Bosco Correa argues that the biggest difference between the phenomenology of Husserl and earlier Edith Stein and that of the Indian Vedanta system is that their method was purely presuppositionless inquiry. There is a rational approach without any prejudices. But in the Indian phenomenology, with given impetus to the scriptural testimony, it is called as Shruti Pramana in Sanskrit, where reason has only a secondary role in the Vedantic search for the Supreme Self. But it is interesting to note the giant leap, or we could also call it as a risky leap, of Edith Stein to the ontological level, so that we find our finite being, which is the phenomena. Now, coming on to the understanding of the ego and self in Edith Stein and Indian spirituality. The key concept in both Stein's thought and Vedantic philosophy is a relationship between the ego and the true self. In Upanishads, the ego, ahangara, is viewed as an illusory construct that prevents the individual from realizing their true nature. The ego creates a sense of separation from the divine and from other beings, and spiritual practice involves the dissolution of this illusion. As Upanishadic sages often state, Tattvamasi, that thou art, meaning that the individual self is not separate from the ultimate reality. Stein's philosophy echoes this view in her treatment of the ego as a false self. For her, the ego represents a limited, finite way of understanding, one that is merged in self centeredness and disconnected from the transcendent dimension of the soul. Like the Upanishads, Stein emphasizes the ultimate truth is found only when the ego's illusion of separation is overcome and the soul recognizes its true nature as one with God. Entering into the next comparison, in the Steinian and Indian perspective, we see what is suffering. Another key area where Edith Stein's thought intersects with Indian spirituality is in the treatment of suffering. Stein's life was marked by personal intellectual struggles as well as the profound suffering of the Holocaust, which she ultimately endured in the concentration camps. For Stein, suffering was inextricably linked to the mystery of the cross, and she viewed it as a means of participating in the redemptive work of Christ. In contrast to the Christian view of suffering as potentially redemptive through grace and union with the divine, Indian traditions tend to view suffering as something to transcend or overcome through spiritual discipline. Both Stein and Indian spirituality acknowledge the reality of suffering, but Stein places suffering within the framework of grace and redemption, whereas the Indian traditions more often emphasize the cessation of suffering through self-transformation and dissolution of the ego, the ahankara. The most celebrated theme in Edith Stein, as we know, empathy, Einfühlung, how it can be understood in Indian spirituality. Stein defines empathy as those fundamental inner acts that enable one person to perceive the experience of another. In Indian spiritual traditions, particularly with Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, the concept of karuna, often translated as compassion or empathy, plays a central role in the cultivation of moral and spiritual virtues. Derived from the Sanskrit root karu, meaning to do, karma, to do, or to act. Karuna is understood as a feeling of deep sympathy for the suffering of others, accompanied by a desire to relieve that suffering. For Stein, empathy leads to a deeper union with others and with God. Empathy is an avenue for spiritual transformation, where self-giving love leads to the elevation of the soul. It is both an intellectual and mystical experience, as the empathic person is invited to transcend individual ego and enter into the experience of others. Karuna in Indian spirituality similarly leads to spiritual liberation. In Buddhism, cultivating karuna helps to overcome attachment and ego, fostering a deeper connection to the world and ultimately to nirvana, liberation from suffering. And whereas in Hinduism and Jainism, this karuna leads to moksha, again, the same concept of liberation through selfless action and compassion for all beings. Now, just a recap. We have seen the major tenets in this comparative study and how the concepts of Atman and Brahman is introduced in the Indian philosophical tradition and how it leads to mysticism and the understanding of the Upanishadic literature, the understanding of self, soul, and person in Stein and in Indian spirituality, the composition of human being of the body, soul, and spirit, along with the Indian categories of Sharira, Atma, and the idea of self-surrender in love, the Sharanakati in Indian tradition, and the phenomenology of Indian scriptures with that of Edith Stein, Indian scriptures refer to the testimony of word, the Shruti, whereas in the later Edith Stein we see the metaphysical realm, understanding the ego and the self in Indian spirituality and how the suffering and empathy can be portrayed in the Steinian and Indian perspective. Conclusion. The central aim of this research, therefore, is to promote an in-depth discussion about the metacultural perspective and thus able to lead us into a new form of dialogue among cultures, or we would like to designate as inter-philosophical, inter-theological, inter-spiritual approach. Indeed, this study strives to overcome the cultural, linguistic, and terminological barriers of human cognition towards a foundational understanding of one's identity in a fragmented world of clashing ideologies, practical hegemonies, divisions, and multiform disputes. Undertaking of comparing, contrasting, and establishing the mystical understanding of human being in each hemisphere of this world is very much needed. In the words of Edith Stein, the one who seeks after truth seeks God, whether it is evident to him or not. And also in the words of the great Indian mantra from Upanishad, the most finest part of the Indian spirituality, that reads, Asatoma Sat Gamaya, Mritorma Amridam Gamaya, Tamasoma Jyotir Gamaya, which means from falsity to truth, from death to eternity, from darkness to light, lead me, O Lord. And will finally saying in my mother tongue, Tamil, one of the oldest languages in the world, Pirapokkum ella uirkum, which means the well-being of everyone and everything. That is our common concern in our intercultural, interspiritual study on Edith Stein and Indian spirituality. I end this paper on the contextual study of Edith Stein in the Indian spiritual tradition. Thank you. Danke. Grazie mille.